All right. Is that all right?
That was you?
Okay. All right. I'm good now. I thought I was going to be in stereo there for a second. Thank you. I'd like to call the Village of Cottage Grove Budget Review Committee to order on Wednesday, August 28th. It's 5:30 on my watch. We are in the Village Hall as well as on Zoom. The Zoom link is atop the agenda. With that, we have a quorum, and the agenda was properly posted, and we'll pause for public's opportunity to speak. If public does wish to speak, we just ask that you share your name, your address, your municipality, and hold your comments to no more than 3 minutes in case we have a lot of folks who would like to speak. So with that, I'll be quiet. Anybody in the room or on Zoom? All right. With that, then we'll move in to discuss and consider our meeting minutes from the review meeting held way back, October 30th, 2023. Any questions, comments, or edits in regards to the meeting minutes as presented?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes as presented.
I'll second.
I'll second.
We have a motion and a second then. Any other discussion? Having heard none, all those in favor? Aye. Anybody opposed? Anybody abstain? Motion carries. I just got a note from Sarah. She's trying to wrestle her computer right now, so she'll join as soon as she can. So with that, we'll grab right into the heart of this discussion with the 2025 fiscal management plan. And this is Cameron Show along with Greg from Ellers.
And Greg, you can go.
Oh, sorry, Harry Allen. Oh, and Harry from Ellers as well.
Good afternoon. So you have a copy of the 2025 financial management plan. So we've done this update now for several consecutive years. This is usually kind of part of the kickoff to your upcoming budget process, where we do the long-range forecast for both operational and capital needs for the village. So we'll get right into it here. So as I just mentioned, really the primary objective of this exercise is to kind of look at your overall financial condition, how things are trending with your existing services, looking at your capital needs, as well as future debt issuance. We've been asked to kind of model 3 different borrowing scenarios for major capital projects, so that's been included in the presentation this evening. And then we always look at, kind of long-term financial trends, look at levy limits, and just making sure that, we identify any issues that need to be addressed on the horizon. So that's kind of our objectives here this afternoon. We always like to start with just kind of the rating assessment that the village receives from Standard & Poor's. Typically, when the village goes into the bond market to finance projects, the village gets a rating from S&P. Even if you're not in the bond market, they typically do what are called surveillance ratings, where they just check in when audits are posted and things of that nature. Really, from the 2024 report, there's really no changes in terms of what was highlighted in the 2023 report, largely very favorable credit report. The village is rated AA stable, which is an outstanding credit rating. They note historically that the village has had very healthy reserve levels and fund balance levels. We'll talk about that as part of the presentation. So that's always been a very strong credit metric and assessment for the village, and certainly something that you have, some direct control over in terms of your ability to manage. And the village has historically done an exceptional job with that. They note, very strong management practices with good financial policies, comprehensive budget construction and monitoring, and then they note that you go through this process on an annual basis in terms of doing long-range financial and capital planning. So that's built into their overall management assessment of your practices. They note that over the past couple of years, you've had some higher debt issuance as you've invested in some infrastructure. So they note while that is kind of elevated over the last couple of years, they note that it's proactively managed and within reason in terms of your ability to handle it. So they always look at not only where you're at in terms of comparisons to other comparably rated communities nationwide, but they also look at your ability to handle it and manage it. And that is something that they note that the village has done well and proactively. So in terms of your fund balance metrics, this is again one of the key metrics of many that S&P evaluates. Your general fund with unassigned and assigned is a percent of your total expenditures. This shows audited history from 2017 through 2023. You can see for all those years, you've been at 30% or higher. Your policy calls that your fund balance is to be at least between 20 and 30% of general fund expenditures. So you've consistently trended slightly higher than that, which is kind of where S&P kind of has you pegged, because that's where they've seen you at. We get the question often, well, if you would drop down to, within a range that's still within your policy, so say down to 20%, would that have implications on your credit rating? And the answer is it likely could. Even if you're still within a range that's established by your policy, if you've historically been slightly higher than that policy, that's kind of where they're evaluating you in terms of their overall benchmarking. So while the range is good, you also want to look at where you've been historically, and the village has done a great job of kind of very consistent with its overall fund balance metrics. So this next slide is really kind of a worst case scenario. So if your expenditures continue to go up, but you didn't really see any growth in your fund balance, how would that same percentage metric change over the next 4 years? You would kind of go down to that kind of mid 20% range. So you'd still be within the range of your policy, right in the middle of your range. But if there was, if your expenditures go up and your fund balance stays flat, that's obviously that percentage is going to come down. So this isn't where we're projecting you'll likely be. It's just, again, if the fund balance didn't grow, but your expenditures went up, you kind of see that drop down by about 10%. Over the planning period. So again, not really what we're anticipating or where the village has historically been, but it just kind of shows how that metric can change if those two variables kind of counteract each other, as this chart illustrates. So next we want to touch on levy limits. Levy limits have been in place since 2005. There's been kind of various variations of levy limits in terms of what that allowable levy increase will be, but it has always been tied to net new construction from the preceding year. So the levy limits, every year the Department of Revenue in August publishes the net new construction percentage, and that defines how much you can increase your levy by before you apply other permitted adjustments. The other permitted adjustments that the village consistently takes advantage of is adjustments for general obligation debt. General obligation debt is exempt from levy limits, so you can legally levy whatever is necessary to repay your debt service. On this chart, we just show how much the village has been allowed to increase its levy going back to 2019, just based off of the net new construction metric. So this isn't the total amount that your levy is allowed to be increased by, it's just the portion of it that's tied to net new construction. So that net new construction percentage for 2024, which impacts your 2025 budget, is 4.356%. That will net you an additional $110,350 of levy authority for your 2025 budget, and then you can increase your levy to cover debt service. And there's other adjustments on the levy limit worksheet, but historically what the village has utilized, which is consistent with what most municipalities use, is that adjustment for debt. So this just kind of shows the net new construction portion of that allowable increase. Next, we're going to speak to some of our valuation projections that we use in our model. The model that we've used here is consistent with how we've modeled it in past years when we update it. We just take into account the next year's worth of information and valuation. The 1/1/24 values were just certified by the Department of Revenue on August 15th. Our intention here is to be conservative in terms of our growth assumptions. On the top half of this spreadsheet, you'll see the 5-year history of the TID-out equalized value. This is the growth in the village's tax rate, excluding incremental value in your TIF districts. When we look at the tax rate projections for each of the scenarios and the debt and the model, it's all driven by these TID-out valuation projections. So we've really looked at kind of your 5-year history of growth, and we've discounted that by 50%, which results in growth of a little over 5% per year. But then we've also factored in the 5-year planning period, any other adjustments to that value, value. And the most notable one is going to be the closure of TID District Number 5. With the current incremental values that got released as of 1/1/24, and then we've been working with Cameron to kind of forecast out the remaining largely incentive payments that are tied to development agreements within the district. Pretty much as every year we get a little closer to kind of locking this in. 2026 really looks like the year that the district will be in position to close. So you would collect increment in 2026, pay off remaining obligations or set aside fund balance to pay off any remaining obligations beyond 2026. And then if the district closes, that incremental value would return to the tax rolls, which would impact your 2027 budget. In this model, we're assuming you would not be doing the one-year affordable housing extension. So we're estimating the incremental value at the time of the TID closure would be about $232 million of value. So that's going to, all that taxable value returns to the tax rolls at once. So you'll see that that could potentially result in the village's TID out equalized value as a 1/1/25 to 1/1/26, increasing by a little over 25%. So, I mean, that's a notable event, and that's really, part of the benefit of going through this exercise annually is to kind of see the impact of that coming in advance to make necessary plans for the budgetary impact. So in terms of the general fund revenue projections, we do all of our projections on a line item basis. So in your general fund, you have all revenues for your property taxes, your intergovernmental revenues, licenses and permits, public charges, so on and so forth. We do the projections on a line item basis, but when we go through the financial management plan updates, we really try to focus more on long-term trends and where things are going. You'll have the opportunity to go through the line items when you do your annual budget update. Here we want to kind of focus on larger trends and kind of the bigger picture. But in terms of just some of the summary of the methodology, we're projecting that your shared revenue would increase about 2% annually. You may recall for the 2024 budget, there was changes to the last state two-year budget that made changes to the intergovernmental aids, the state shared revenue formula, and so the village, along with every community in Wisconsin, saw an increase in those shared revenue payments for the first time in a very long time. And some of those increases for future shared revenue can be tied to state sales tax collection. So we forecasted about 2% growth. As of January 1st of 2024, personal property in Wisconsin became exempt. It is no longer part of your tax base. So to make up for that loss of that taxable value, there is an increased personal property aid payment that will be coming to the village's general fund. That is going to be an additional $38,621. So that will remain consistent going forward, but we forecasted that in our model as well. We've conservatively projected some increase in your transportation aids at about 4.5%, which is largely tied back to kind of investment in road infrastructure and maintenance. So that's a conservative estimate. Just some adjustments to your charges for refuse collection, and then most of your other non-levy revenue sources, licenses and permits, public charges, miscellaneous revenues, don't fluctuate too much year over year, generally speaking. That's consistent with what we see with most communities in Wisconsin, so we kind of keep that consistent in our forecasting methodology. And then there's just the note that one of the stipulations with the increased shared revenue that was first received in the 2024 budget is that you must maintain the spending levels for law enforcement, fire, and EMS, at least equivalent to the previous year to kind of maintain and keep that increased shared revenue. So that's kind of what's typically called a maintenance of effort requirement that was tied to that increased shared revenue, and that's for all municipalities. On the expenditure side, similar approach. We do line item forecasting for all the line items and all the departments across the general fund, but we kind of summarize our approach. So we kind of assign a classification code to each of the line items. You have commodities, general supplies, your employee insurance coverages that are tied to your benefits packages, broader insurance coverages, property and liability, workers' compensation, and the like. just general contractual services, and then your wages. So we've kind of forecasted increases in those line items just based on this methodology, just to take into account, continued changes in costs going forward. So this is pretty consistent with what we used last year. In discussions with staff, felt that was still a reasonable estimate to use going forward. So kind of bringing the general fund summary all together, this is the main operational fund of the village. So on the top, we have some years of history, 2020 through 2023, the total revenues, and then down below the total expenditures. We've made a few formatting and presentation changes to this particular chart. On the expenditure side for public safety, we've just delineated public safety by police, fire, EMS, and other. The other is largely inspection services. That's generally what falls into that category. And then all the other categories are similar to how we've presented this information in the past. So the line on the bottom of this chart just shows how your general fund levy would change from the year prior going forward. So we've show that change just for the general fund. We're going to look at the total levy change as we get farther into the model, particularly once we incorporate debt service. So I'll pause here, see if there's any initial questions or if staff has anything they want to add so far. All right. So next, we'll switch our attention to the capital options. We were asked to model kind of 3 different scenarios for capital projects that are financed with debt. We're finance people. We're not creative with our naming, so we have bare bones, middle, and all in. So nothing too alarming about that, but it kind of describes kind of the 3 scenarios. So in all 3 scenarios, there's consistent level of funding year over year for regular vehicle and equipment replacements, road and trail maintenance. So there's amounts identified to be funded each year. Those are the same in all 3 scenarios. There's no difference. So that adds up. All those items add up to about $11.5 million from 2025 through 2034. Really what changes in these 3 scenarios is kind of the major projects that are financed. So in the bare bones model, we have 25 million of projects from 2025 to 2028. The middle is 29.9 million from 2025 to 2031. And then the all-in model is 43.3 million funded from 2025 through 2034. So we included detailed project lists for each of the 3 scenarios for the major projects. Again, what's in there for vehicles and equipment and road and trail maintenance is the same in all 3 scenarios. So in terms of the bare bones, I understand you've had conversations at recent meetings about kind of prioritization of capital projects. So these were kind of the major capital projects that were provided to us as a follow-up to those discussions. So we list each project and the year that it's anticipated to be funded. In all these models, there is, the anticipated cost for the police station. And then in all of these models, there was some unspent debt proceeds from 2024 of about $950,000. So that's going to be applied to your 2025 project cost to reduce the amount that you need to borrow. So those are items that are consistent. The other projects kind of change based on each scenario. So show the same chart for the middle of the road scenario and kind of the additional projects that are added. So this goes out a little bit farther, out till 2031. And then for the all-in scenario, kind of show that full build out of projects. So again, this is from your prioritization in terms of establishment of which projects to include in each scenario. So we'll look at kind of the debt impact and borrowing capacity impact for each of these capital models. So before we look at the impact of those 3 capital scenarios, we like to start with just your existing general obligation debt, your obligations that are already outstanding. So on the far left-hand side of this chart, we show your gross principal and interest payments annually from 2024 through 2043. And then we show non-levy revenue sources that the village typically budgets to pay for some of that principal and interest. So namely revenues from TIF districts and then some revenue for projects that would attributable to the water and sewer utility. Those respective utilities pay their share of the debt service. The premium refers to when we typically sell notes or bonds in the market. A lot of times the underwriters will give you what's called a premium bid, where they give you excess cash. Under state law, a portion of that premium has to go into the debt service fund to pay interest expense. So that's money that's already in your debt service fund that under state law has to be obligated to be spent on interest payments. So that's factored in. So then we have kind of that net tax levy that shows just where your levy is trending just for existing debt outstanding. And then we show the tax rate per thousand on an equalized basis. And then $100,000 of value just shows how much of your tax bill presently goes towards debt service. And we're going to look at how that changes when we look at the three scenarios. So first, let's kind of start with the bare bones scenario. So we have your existing debt levy here on the far left-hand side, and then we have your future debt service for all the equipment and road and trail maintenance, and then the major projects included in this scenario. And then we show what your total new debt service levy would be, taking into account existing and all the future debt issuance in this scenario. So you'll see your levy kind of gradually ramps up from 2025 to 2026. And then in 2027, you see that the levy for debt service would increase by about $1,250,000. That's the police station coming online. So that would be financed in this model in 2026. That hits the debt service levy in 2027. And then the debt service levy increase starts to moderate from 2028 through 2035. So it kind of shows that levy increase kind of remains stable at about $200,000 per year. So again, kind of shows what that impact, and then for $100,000 of value just shows the portion of the tax bill that would go for debt service. And so that number in the far right-hand column is existing and proposed debt. So for every $100,000 of value, that's how much of the tax bill would go to repay debt service. So in terms of your general obligation debt borrowing capacity, this is defined under state law. The amount of general obligation principal you have outstanding cannot exceed 5% of the village's TID-in equalized values. This is where the only part of the analysis where the TID-in numbers are applicable. So at the year ending of 2024, our current fiscal year, the village will have about $31.9 million of debt outstanding. That's principal on a general obligation basis. That's about 44% of your debt limit. So you have $40.2 million of borrowing capacity remaining. So with all the projects funded in the bare bones scenario, your general obligation debt capacity kind of tops out in 2026 at 57%, which is a very comfortable level to be at. Leaves room for other capital borrowings. We're presently working with the village on some long-range forecasting for your enterprise funds, your utilities, and looking at some of those needs on the sewer side. There may be some sewer projects that potentially could be funded with general obligation debt as well, which kind of keeps some of the sewer rate increases down because general obligation debt generally has lower interest rates. The alternative to general obligation debt is what's called revenue debt, where you're legally pledging some other revenue other than property taxes to repay the debt service. The most common forms of revenue debt are revenue debt that's backed by utility revenue. The main reason a community may choose to use revenue debt is that there's no legal limit on the amount of revenue debt you can have outstanding. So you can issue as much as you're comfortable repaying. So I think those are things that we'll kind of continue to monitor, but that's not reflected yet in this analysis, but again, shows you're at about 50%, 57% of your borrowing limit with the bare bones scenario. So just to look at how that changes with the middle of the road scenario, so the exact same chart. So you'll see that those, debt service levy increases, gradually ramp up as you start adding more projects. So, using years 2028 through 2035 as an example, instead of that levy increase being about $200,000 per year from the bare bones, you're up to about $225,000 per year. So that's kind of the incremental cost increase of this particular scenario, using those years as an example. And then in the same format of the chart, far right-hand column, for every $100,000 of value, it shows, what that total tax bill would be just for general obligation debt service. So in terms of borrowing capacity, not a appreciable material impact change here. Instead of topping out at 57%, you're topping out at 59%. So, in the grand scheme of things, very comparable. So from a borrowing capacity perspective, there's really not much difference between the bare bones scenario and the middle of the road scenario. So finally, in terms of that all-in model, so this, included higher borrowing amounts, and the plan for capital projects went out a little bit farther. So here we're kind of looking at, that debt service levy increase from 2028 to 2035 at about $345,000 per year. So, more notable, increase in this particular model, but there's, significantly more capital projects being funded, as we talked about in kind of the summary. So again, that for every $100,000 of value, you'll see that how that impacts the portion of the tax bill that would be related to general obligation debt. So in terms of the borrowing capacity, so here we kind of top out at about 61%. In this particular scenario in 2026, and then gradually starts to kind of decline and moderate going forward. So really all three of these scenarios, still leave some room for some other projects that may not be reflected in this particular analysis. But I mean, we're at a comfortable point in terms of your core projects that would be obligated to primarily fund with general obligation debt. So, as your valuations increase year over year, and you continue to see some significant growth, that's helping these projections going forward. And we are, I should have mentioned, with all of these borrowing capacity projections, we are factoring in the increase in value as a result of Amazon and TID 10. We're using $245 million of value as what we're projecting that will be phased in over about a 3-year period. So it's kind of a conservative projection that we've consistently been using in our models going forward. It's just the timing of it has changed as the build-out schedule changes. So in terms of the overall tax levy impact, so this kind of brings together everything we've been talking about up until this point. So we have your total levy projected on this slide. So your levy consists primarily going forward of your general fund, and then your levy for debt service, and then new debt. So you'll see in the charts that's kind of highlighted in yellow, that's where your total levy is projected for everything in the bare bones scenario. Then you'll see in the center of the chart, kind of, again, using just $100,000 of value on both an equalized and assessed basis, kind of what that change would be or what that taxes would be on $100,000 of value. And then we show down below the equalized tax rate, how that would change in the model going forward. So in all the scenarios, we also look at, the levy limits. So similar to kind of what we were projecting last year, projecting the first year in the model where there's a levy limit gap is in 2027, although the levy limit gap is slightly reduced from what we were projecting last year, but still generally comparable. And then it starts to increase going forward. So again, that's kind of one of the key things that we focus on in this multi-year forecast is kind of identifying, when you're going to start to see some fiscal pressures from a levy limit standpoint. This isn't unusual in terms of, models that we're developing for communities around the state. Literally presented this exact same thing to another community last night, and they're kind of on a similar trajectory, and starting to kind of see the levy limit impact coming forward in the next couple of years. Really, at a high level, it's levy limits have been in place since 2005. You've seen kind of what you've been allowed to increase your levy just due to net new construction, particularly over the last couple of years, as you've seen inflationary pressures be a little more significant, but thankfully that's somewhat started to moderate. You're just starting to see, after going on close to 20 years here of levy limits, that it's just starting to kind of run its course for a lot of communities. So the fact that you have a gap in and of itself, and there's a lot that can change in this model, even in a 3-year period. It's not alarming in and of by itself, but it just, again, kind of shows that there's there's things to be aware of kind of going forward, but there's, you're not alone. We're seeing a large uptick in the number of communities that are starting to do levy limit referendums just because they feel they need a reliable and permanent funding source to kind of keep existing services at their present levels. So, similar messaging to what we've kind of given in past years, and the model's kind of concluding similar results in the timing of those impacts. So not much changed in terms of the 5-year timing of some of these levy limit gaps, but just wanted to kind of make those general comments. So next, the middle of the road scenario. So again, kind of exact same information kind of presented, so kind of shows how that change in the levy is going to change. Again, the only real difference between all three of these scenarios is the levy for debt service. There's no change in the operational levy. It's the same. The levy limit gap is the same for each of these scenarios. So it's really just those overall levy increases and the tax rate changes is really what the difference is in these models, and that's entirely driven by changes in debt service based on the level of major projects that are funded. So same projection for the all-in model that kind of includes, again, kind of those forecasted levy increases, and then we show the total tax rate on an equalized basis for this scenario as well. So to kind of take all of this and try to kind of summarize it in some, well, I'll get to that in a moment. On the levy limit gap, this is just the forecast of the levy limit worksheet. I'm not going to go through this line by line because, as I always say, it's incredibly dull and boring. And if it hasn't been dull and boring already, I promise this would make it dull and boring. But nevertheless, we kind of project forward kind of your allowable change due to net new construction. So again, for this year, that's at about 4.356%. We forecasted that at about 4% for the 2026 budget. And then that kind of starts to ramp up by the 2028 and 2029 budget. That's largely driven by increases in value in TID 10 due to Amazon. So we adjust this kind of every year as we get different new information and another year's worth of data, but we're trying to kind of be consistent and conservative in our forecasting. So really this is just mimics the actual levy limit worksheet that has to get filed. This is actually a consolidated version of it because it's a 2-page form that has all kinds of adjustments, but we factor in the ones that are most prevalent and applicable to the village. So this is just showing how we arrived at our calculations. So that overall summary, just kind of looking at kind of some high-level trends for each of these scenarios. So looking at the total levy change, so that's general fund and existing debt and proposed debt for the bare bones over 5 years. That average change per year to the levy, that averages 12% per year. The average equalized tax rate per thousand over a 5-year period is $6.24 per thousand of value. As I mentioned, the max geo debt capacity is at 57%. And then all three scenarios, your levy limit gap starts in 2027. So the middle of the road, that 5-year average for the levy change per year goes to about 13%. The average tax rate per thousand over 5 years is $6.33, so about 9 cents higher. Debt capacity again is at 59%. And then the all-in scenario, also averaged levy increase change per year of 13% over the 5-year planning model. The tax rate per thousand on an equalized basis averages $6.42 per thousand. So you can see how that compares between the three scenarios. And then your max geo debt capacity hits 61% in 2026. So lots of different ways you can kind of slice and dice all this information. We just kind of wanted to provide some general trends and kind of averages just to kind of give you a frame of reference in terms of how this fluctuates, largely due to the increased borrowing levels. Because again, that's really the primary difference in each of these scenarios is those major project amounts that are funded at different levels with each scenario. So finally, I just want to touch on the TIF districts. For each of the TIDs, we update the cash flow projections for these annually. So we've just did that within the last week, taking into account the 1/1/2024 incremental values that were released and certified by the Department of Revenue. So TID number 5 already has about $232 million of incremental value as of January 1st of 2024. This district is continuing to pay off development incentives as obligated under development agreements and debt that's outstanding. The projected closure is in 2026. The final year of increment collection for that district is in 2027. So right now, it's pretty solid that that's going to close 1 year earlier than the maximum life of the district. TID District number 6 has just under $3 million of incremental value. This district is partially supporting some of the debt that's outstanding for this district. We've been showing the Joint Review Board, when they meet annually, the Joint Review Board is a 5-member panel that consists of all the taxing jurisdictions and a public member. They're required to meet annually to review the performance status of all TIF districts. We've been showing them likely a 6-year extension, which this district is eligible for. We're going to formally request that this year. We've been showing them that for the past several years. So that extends some of the time to allow the district to continue to pay a portion of its debt service, but it's not anticipated that this district will generate enough increment to support all of the debt. That's been something we've kind of known for years. It's been part of this model since we first did it several years ago. TID 8, the incremental value in that district is just shy of 1.5 million. There's some existing what are called pay-as-you-go development incentives. What those are is that the development incentive is paid to the developer based on the increment that their project generates. So you look at that increase in value that they generate from a particular development. A development agreement specifies a specific, typically percentage or dollar amount that can be paid back to that developer up to a specified amount. And so it kind of puts the onus on the developer to generate enough tax increment collection to get repaid per the terms of the development agreement. If a particular project doesn't generate enough increment to reimburse the full amount specified in the development agreement, the village is under no obligation to make up that shortfall. So we kind of call it pay-as-you-go because it gets paid annually based on the amount of increment generated, and they only get paid out based on what the amount of tax increment revenue that a project generates. TID 9 has already over 49 million of incremental value as of January 1 of 2024. You'll recall earlier this year, the village issued some debt to acquire some land in TID District number 9, so that incremental value is more than sufficient to cover the debt service as was expected for that land acquisition. So that's unfolding as expected. Then TID 10, so far to date, has generated a little over 3.7 million of incremental value. There are some pay-as-you-go development incentives in place for that district as well. So all in all, not much changed in the big picture in terms of the village's TIF districts. All the TIF districts are generally in sound financial position. TID 6 is been generating a little less than what was expected. That goes back many, many years. When that district was created, there were some projects that were issued and funded with debt that were TID eligible projects, but there really wasn't increment at the time available to support it, and it took several years for increment to get generated, but that put the district in a deficit position. So as you probably heard me say, when we financed the projects for TID 9, there's a difference between a project being TID eligible and a project being TID feasible. TID eligible just means it's in the project plan, and legally you can use TID increment to pay for it. TID feasible means the increment's actually there. So those are two different things. But all in all, the village has done a strong job of kind of managing the TIF districts and evaluating things and looking at projects on a case-by-case and standalone basis to make sure that they can support their obligations. And the use of the pay-go approach is very common and really minimizes the village's financial risk versus borrowing money and relying on the debt increment to repay the debt service. So that's kind of the overview of the financial management plan. Happy to take questions or allow staff to interject as well, but appreciate your attention thus far. Thank you.
I guess what I'd like the committee to do is ask Greg some questions about the presentation as presented. Once those questions are answered, we'll go through the 3 capital scenarios. Ultimately, I think the village board is looking for a recommendation on a scenario, and then we'll work on the recommendation for Lisa to get to the village board. So any questions for Greg on what was presented?
I was wondering about the unspent debt proceeds. Are those, I'm kind of remembering those from when it's issued to us. It has to be used for what it was issued. So that would go toward public works projects, but it would take away from how much we'd have to borrow in general.
Correct. So there's one notable change, and I know I touched on this briefly back in the spring, but earlier this year, there was it doesn't apply to your, 2024. I got my years wrong, so it does apply. Sorry. Talking about 2025 budget, I'm forgetting what year I'm talking about. So the 24 proceeds, so yeah, that was issued with general obligation promissory notes, which gives the village more flexibility in terms of how that debt, those unspent debt proceeds can be spent. So in many years prior, we issued general obligation corporate purpose bonds, which under state law required you to spend those proceeds for the specific purpose that was identified. So if you were financing, for example, street projects and park projects in the same bond issue, you had to use street money for street projects, park money for park projects. The change in statute that occurred earlier this year changed the term of a general obligation promissory note from 10 years to 20 years. And what that essentially did was, while the bond statutes still exist, they generally really no longer need to be applicable to a financing. So now, when you issue 20-year debt and under the promissory note statute, and you finance a multitude of different types of projects. So using my same example, if you did streets and parks in the same note issue, you can actually spend that money for any type of public improvement. So yeah, that's a benefit of the statutory change to notes. So sorry, I was confused about the year initially.
Yeah, I guess because the annual road and maintenance budget is $1 million, I would again recommend that stays for the recommended purpose. That was largely generated on, we were able to bunch together a ton of street projects and road projects. So the asphalt per unit price was driven down by the magnitude of the project. We've had just some discussions with Strand to get that a little bit closer. But again, every dollar of that's going to be reinvested into the street maintenance.
So legally, you have two options. You can do what you're doing. You can use that to spend it on other capital projects, or absent that, you would use it to pay debt service.
Well, I like that we have those two options, making the dollar stretch further, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
I have some questions, if this is an okay time to ask them from the virtual space.
Go ahead, Sarah.
All right. I just want to confirm, do you think that 5% is enough to estimate for increase in staff benefits, especially health insurance? It sounds like if staff, you agreed with that. That doesn't seem high enough to me, but.
So one of the things that we actively do is, look away, how do we stretch our benefit dollar further? So one of the things we initiated was like an opt-out incentive. That has actually significantly helped, the amount of people who are taking village health insurance has actually gone down. So some departments were actually seeing a cost savings year over year. So I intended to look at these when those percentages really are what is the reflective of the whole organization as opposed to but yeah, I mean, health insurance, in general, the cost to provide health insurance increased 12%. Long-term disability, we're kind of lucky that the state has the rates frozen right now and we're not paying premiums. But again, yeah, aggregated together.
Thank you. And my other question is, and I apologize if you said it, but which number should we use between taxes on 100,000 for assessed value and equalized value? You list both out. Which one should I focus on there?
Sarah, I'm gonna share my screen real quick, and this leads me to a great transition here. So it's a loaded question because I think there's kind of confusion in general when taxpayers receive a tax bill. What are they actually getting taxed on? And that is, and I don't know, are you able to see this, Sarah? You got a box up here that has again, equalized rate, but then this kind of graph or graphic down here is really to try to put it in real dollar cents. So we've kind of have talked about 315,000 being the average assessed value. Again, this is each of these scenarios is projecting a revaluation in 2026. That does not provide the village any additional authority to levy taxes. It just changes, again, the rate that we're able to spread the allowable levy over. So our estimated average value of the assessed value of a home would go to 410. So this demonstrates each option on what would be the impact over a 5-year term. So the bare bone option would represent roughly a $292.25 over 5 years, or an average of $28.45. Again, though, keep in mind, there is a heavier investment in year 25 and 26. And again, with TID 5 closing and coming back to the tax roll in 27, this was very intentional to try to make the impact of the significant facility investments or potential significant facility more palatable, along with the investment. There was debt taken out to acquire the MSB facility that is falling off. So naturally, as kind of the plan to replace that space or make improvement on that space comes on, you're seeing a little bit of a relief here. Over the middle option, we're seeing about a $607.95 impact, or $121.59 per year. All in is $710.45, or average impact of $142.09 per year. Historically, this has been presented at budget meetings, the village is really striving on the average tax bill to be around $100 a year. Last year, a little bit challenging to do in the current environment, but again, over the 5 years, kind of that 100.87, and that's something we very actively try to manage. So to your point, for people who are at home and they're thinking at the assessed value, because that's what they're actually going to pay their tax bill on, kind of paying attention to the assessed value here. When you're kind of looking at a plan like this over the course of 10 years, both historical and future, using equalized value, because that puts what is the actual value of the services that are provided divided by the true value of your home, and that's more consistent and kind of eliminates that revaluation factor, assuming essentially like 100% of your home is valued at any given point in time, because there's large fluctuations in that assessment ratio. So hopefully this was helpful to see. Another thing I guess I do want to point out, I've been working very closely with Public Works and then our general transportation aides. There is a direct, basically, reinvestment into the community in the form of general transportation aid on dollar for dollar spent. We're capped at a 15% increase year over year. We actually in 24 did receive the maximum 15% increase, and again, every dollar that we spent on this, and why, advocating in infrastructure, we're actually seeing some relief in the form of those aids. So when we're talking about like cutting, that should be considered specifically on public work projects and street projects. The more we spend, the more we get back. So even if you cut something, there could also be a revenue perspective, because the formula based, a couple variables, but a 3-year average and a 6-year average combined with total mileage. But we can dive into that further during the public work portion of the budget.
Maybe the only thing I'll add, Cameron, just is to echo some of the points you made. That was a great summary. And in terms of the forecasting, as Cameron mentioned, when we kind of forecast a reval, you're assuming you're going to go back to 100% assessment ratio. You may not. You may be over 100%. You still may be slightly under 100%. And then how is that assessment ratio going to change year over year? That's what makes the forecasting on the assessment ratio harder. But in terms of the equalized value, every tax bill has a market value. That's the equalized value. So you can do the calculation using the assessed tax rate or the equalized tax rate as long as you're using it apples to apples comparison. You're going to arrive at the exact same dollar amount. So I know we've kind of shared models in the past with staff that kind of reverse engineers a tax bill in terms of how you get there. So whether you use an assessed tax rate or a equalized tax rate, it's just making sure you're using your assessed value and using the assessed rate. If you're using equalized, use the fair market value that's on your tax bill.
I also want to add, in 2027, we're modeling the tax relief solely on the village. TID 5 will have an impact on every single portion of your tax bill, and that is not modeled on here. So it will, in theory, reduce Dane County, Monona Grove, as well as Madison Tech College. I'll probably start to get a handle on what that could look like, but again, those are only going to be estimates because we're still, a little bit too far to get that exact.
Thank you, that was very helpful. I do have a few other questions. In looking at the proposed, or the general fund expenditure projections, is that all based on our current staffing levels? So does that include the increase in police we'll need to add as our population goes up, or any other of those factors in the operational costs?
Yeah, great question. So as is, again, we're working with the best information we have. There's, in some departments, it will show kind of flatlined or no additional staffing. In others, like PD, there is an assumption of growth. And EMS, this year, they had requested 2 additional staff members as of January 1. That is forecasted on here, and what I had provided to Greg to it for adjustment. Kind of with this model, we have to get that balance of what's too conservative and what's a more realistic model. With our current population estimate, which didn't go up quite as much as we want, we felt very good with the staffing levels that were presented in this model.
Thank you. And then for the all-in proposal, where we, even on your grid, Greg, you had to stretch out the number of years. Do we need to be looking at the tax impact on the 10-year mark? Because when you look at just compare the 5 years, it feels fairly similar, and it feels like, oh, well, why wouldn't we do the all-in here if we're just talking about, $20 or $40, I don't remember exactly how much, but what is the 10-year impact? Or is that not something to necessarily put much looking into, because it doesn't make sense? I'm not a financial person, so looking for your expertise there.
Yeah, we modeled the debt a little bit farther because your list went farther out, but I mean, we still tried to stick with a 5-year planning horizon. I think that's really probably what's most realistic, given, you look at the situation 5 years ago and where we're at today, a lot has substantially changed in the last 5 years. A lot's changed in the last 2 years. So you can forecast things out as far out as you want to go, but I think it really loses its utility and practical value if you go out too far. So we modeled the debt out because that was kind of what we were asked to do, just to kind of look at the different funding levels. But I think that all-in model and looking at the operations, the 5-year window is really kind of where we need to focus our attention, because I think there's things likely that are going to have to be adjusted just within that 5-year period.
Yeah, and Sarah, what I think part of what you're asking might be presented on page 21, where it does show, again, outside of the operating levy, page 21 will show through 2036 what the additional cost of carrying the additional debt through kind of a little bit further. So what would be missing between years 2030 and 2036 is the operating component.
Okay.
I think that's what your question was.
Yeah.
Yep, thank you. That is very helpful. And one thing that, Cameron, can you put that Excel sheet back up
Yep.
that was helpful for me to see when you actually compared it to the average home. Um,
Yep,
And
give
I'll
me
just write down
one.
the numbers. And then I think I'm complete with my questions. Thanks, everyone.
Let me know if there's anything can show.
I just took a screenshot, so I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions on the plan as presented? All right, so a couple things I guess I just want to bring up, just because, you know, as we're making decisions, I just always want to make sure the village is thinking of things collectively. In working with specifically the utilities, there is an option where 2 projects were only included in the all-in, but projects that the utility portion would have to move forward regardless of the decision that Public Works moves forward, and that is Ollie Street. Again, initially recommended in 2026, and after further discussion, that will be actually recommended in 2027. The other one would be the path connection to McCarthy Park. Again, this was a creative way of, we're already going to be in the ground. How can we provide some additional amenities at kind of a cost-effective? So this would essentially be overlaying a path on top of the water loop that's going to need to be done, and again, connect to McCarthy Park. McCarthy Park, this path connection scored a 3.0 grade. Again, this is a water project too. So the cost that was presented was the public work portion or the path portion of the project. And then with Ollie Street, again, the road needs to be replaced anyways. That cost in 26 was $525,000, and this scored a 2.43 grade. So that would be one or 2 items I guess I would ask the committee to recommend adding in any scenario recommended. And yeah, I guess we'll turn it over to the committee to talk about the 3 different scenarios.
All right, thanks, Cameron, and thanks, Greg. Comments, questions in regards to the scenarios now, or thoughts? I guess if you guys are still ciphering, carrying the 2 and adding 1 times 2, I'll throw mine in. At this point, based on a lot of different things that are going on, not only with the village as well as outside the village purview, I think we should start with just the bare bones, add those 2 projects, Ollie and McCarthy, to that mix, at least for this cycle, and see where we're at, going forward. If we can get some relief for taxpayers with TID 5 closing out, that would be really nice, based on the feedback I've been getting last week on various other things. And then, obviously, as there's room going forward, because we do this every single year, we can, there's things we can end up adding back in appropriately that should be added in. And there's still some wild cards with some utility stuff too, right? With off Taylor, perhaps. There might be some impact there, depending on what goes on with that proposed development.
I just had a quick question about the East Taylor Wheelbridge Main Street.
Can you turn your mic on?
Oh, sorry. Had a question about the East Taylor Wheelbridge Main Street intersection improvements. I know we talked about this in Public Works. Is that being driven by a need for some utility work, or is that, I know we were talking about what we were gonna do, or ideas we're throwing around to improve that intersection. Do you know, I feel like I should know what we're doing there, but what's driving that? Because, I mean, the intersection seems fine.
So I'm going to share on the screen just so the public can see this conversation. This was out of the capital prioritization plan and the justification that was provided by Public Works. It looks like this is not utility driven. This is purely to improve public safety
yeah,
and
Yeah.
yep.
So they're putting flashing lights and curb extensions, that's what I remember the discussion as, but,
Yeah, so this is a great question. So what would happen is this plan would establish the original like kind of project idea and scope. So when you have a discussion for Public Works, they'll bring what they're actually recommending to be done. I don't have the full scope of what this project is.
okay,
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
JJ and Kyla, go for it.
And I think I missed a meeting too, so maybe they talked about.
I love berries. I know you met with Josh very recently there.
Yes, so as a part of that, Strand is looking for a task order cost. I have received that recently. They have not started design for that, but it is going to be some pedestrian improvements. They're planning to come with Public Works with 3 different options to then recommend moving forward.
Okay.
So one of the things I guess I want to make sure I comment about that project specifically is anything that you see in 2026 has to have engineering work done the year before. So during the 2024 budget process, there had already been budgeted amounts allocated to complete the engineer work for that.
Okay.
And so this represents pure construction costs.
So just as a side note to that, again, the village continues to be challenged to get folks that will volunteer or get paid, but folks that'll do the crosswalks. And this is a fairly heavily trafficked area
Yeah.
where
for
we have
school.
a lot of
That's right.
little ones going through there. And then we also have the community school thing starting as well. So I think we'll see perhaps even more foot traffic there.
Okay.
So that's another, kind of push for the village to kind of get that one going.
Sounds good.
There are 4 other projects that I'd like to talk about and get some feedback on. The first is the Shady Grove Park, and that's listed to be under debt. However, the Parks Committee could modify the plans for that to do in phases, and it would fall completely in the Park Development Fund. So I'm not sure how we can designate that, but that would not be funded with debt then, but we could still proceed with completing something. So I'm not sure how that could be indicated on here.
So what I would recommend is, the committee should have a discussion on, essentially pushing this back to Parks and what could a reduced scope of the plan be done within the scope of, if we have 200 or 250,000 of funds we've already collected to do that park, let's go ahead and do that improvement. And then what could phase 2 be? I think that's a great idea. I think originally at the prioritization process, I just mentioned, we've already collected some of that money. So pushing that project out just makes it more expensive and we're not getting any more money on the money we've already collected outside of interest.
And there's a decent amount of money that's undesignated to be used in a certain area because it was collected from apartment buildings that don't have parkland dedicated to them. So that can be used in the park. So would you recommend removing it from the plan or keeping it in the plan knowing that we would utilize Park Development Fund for it?
I would say recommend keeping it in the plan, but kind of like what we do with the less unspent bond proceeds, we would do less park development fees.
Okay.
So are you talking about like 50/50, half in 24 and half in 26, 25 and 26? Or what are you saying? Or
I would say
all of it with park development funds?
Yeah, I would say the second phase could probably, again, without a Strand analysis or Sean's analysis, I would say maybe it's 26 and then the rest doesn't get completed to 2030. Because we would try to wait to see the rest, collect the rest of the remaining parcel fees and then do phase 2.
Yeah, I think the committee would agree to that. I think that we have the funds to be able to make something work within those funds. The next project I wanted to talk a little bit about is the North Lawn Pond, because I know that we have to meet some requirements as part of our watershed and sewer requirements, and we may start to get, I'm not sure what the penalty is for not making progress toward, is it phosphate reduction, or there's some kind of reduction we have to start to make, and there's grants available for that. And I know we're not eligible for very many grants, but we are eligible, I believe, for something along these lines.
So I'll kind of preliminary cover it before I kick it off to JJ or Kyla. Again, they weren't expecting to speak today, but they'll provide some maybe additional context. So we did engage Strand to basically do an analysis on applying for a grant in 2023. It has identified we were able to update that kind of plan. The village, in the proposed budget that this group will see, there'll be the full $160,000 request for again, I don't know if it's the full plan or the build out or implementation plan. Kyla?
It's essentially a report and an analysis of all of our existing stormwater infrastructures to update and keep looking at the TSS and the phosphorus reductions to continue to meet those credits.
And then this would lead into getting a potentially grant to offset 50% of that project. So now you're talking about 800 or 900,000 of this being covered with grant. I would strongly recommend when we get to the budget review committee that we continue that study to, again, have a plan, get as much state funding as possible to offset these costs. Now, I guess the question is, how do we move forward with this plan? I guess Kyla or Jade, is 2026, even if we do that plan, is that even too soon? Like, is 27 maybe a better year for that project?
I believe it's every 2 years. I don't know the details of that, as I wasn't super involved in that. JJ, do you know?
I believe, sorry, it's getting louder around here. I do believe that was based on the anticipated award, but we could talk with Josh. I think you can accept the award and in the truck following year.
I think we can get an answer for the village board on September 3rd. So you can give us direction to have that additional information to make that final decision.
Thank you. The other two projects are kind of, I see as the most pressing pedestrian safety besides the, when they switch to the neighborhood schools for the Taylor Wheel Bridge Main Street, is the BB and bus and the Vilas Road path to Bakken. And I know that we have had developers proposing to build there at BB and bus, but I'd be interested in maybe adding this later in the plan to see if that comes to reality, give it a little time. But I do know that there are children under 10 years of age walking along Cottage Grove Road. I know them personally that go to cross at Damascus from Shady Grove. So I think that, that definitely makes me very nervous, and I think that that should be a priority. And then same with the Vilas Road. It's such a small segment to get people from that whole half of the village over to Bakken Park. We've made so many investments there, so I think that would be another project worthwhile to keep in.
What was the last project?
The Vilas Road to Bakken Park.
Thank you.
So that's kind of like a new middle, right? What we just discussed, bare bones plus these few potentials.
It looks like a smaller middle, like a more.
Smaller middle of small medium.
We're all striving for a smaller
Looking for
middle,
the
right?
summer look.
Yeah, it looks like it went from, we slimmed down from middle, but we're a little bit more plump with the bare bones.
Other comments from committee members?
Just from what John, sorry, Sarah.
Oh, go ahead.
Just from what John echoed earlier, I can't see going above, like, middle or all in, just with some other things going on in the community. Will make a lot of people upset, I feel like.
The one comment I will add, I think Sean needs some direction on how to address community park and the ADA issues. If you'd like him to go and work and maybe get a reduced scope, and what does it take to do the minimum, like the bathrooms or whatever, to make ADA? But he's expressed significant concerns about the functionality of that shelter. So we can kind of table it for this year and bring it back next year. But he's definitely going to need some direction on how does he move improving that space within financial restraints.
Yeah, I think I'd be in favor of getting, like, what's the minimum that we can do there? And so taking it off this year and perhaps adding it back in our changes.
I'll see if it's realistic to get you guys something by park. It will be kind of funny the way it will be presented. It won't be a 25 project in the budget, but maybe an alternative to consider in the future.
I was
So-
just gonna say, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Sarah.
That's okay. I can't see who is in the room about to talk, so I don't mean to talk over folks. I agree with Heidi's additions. I think those are some fairly reasonably priced safety improvements that we could make for those pedestrian areas. And then if we can work in Shady Grove, obviously with the park fees, that makes sense. So I would support that.
So I think I've heard general consensus that let's start with the bare bones plan. And so there's been a couple different versions of the bare bone plan that have been discussed. We'll call it the new bare bone all in, with having projects as presented, plus Ollie, plus McCarthy Pack, plus Shady Grove, but again, that being covered with park development fees, the North Lawn improvements, and then Vilas to Bakken. Did I miss any?
BB and bus. And I know that's kind of not, if development occurs there and the intersection's improved and the pedestrian infrastructure is included in the development, which is the, feedback we gave at Plan Commission to do that, and the developer's in favor of doing that. I mean, that just drops off the project list. Is that kind of what would happen?
Can you say that again, Heidi?
So if the development does move forward, I know Heyday is presented, then this would just drop off of our project list. Is that, and we would update that in the future that we no longer needed to do that project? Or is it better to keep it off and add it on if we need to later, the BB and bus?
Heidi, there'll be a point that is village responsibility, even if the developer put it.
We didn't quite get all that, JJ, but I don't know.
It's not your fault, JJ. Our speakers in the room are. It's tough for hybrid meetings from the outside.
Well, I'll try again. There will be a portion that's ours. The number will be reduced if the developer comes along.
Gotcha. That's what I thought you said, but thank you.
So we'll call, and again, for complete transparency's sake, I'm gonna read this from the all-in, but this is what the new all-in bare bones is.
Careful, don't say all in, and then we already have an all in. Call it something else. Great, come up
The-
with a new
the-
name.
we'll call it the Great Compromise Plus. So that would be East Taylor, Wheelbridge, Main Street intersection, bike path extension, the police station, ladder truck, Shady Grove, North Lawn Pond, Ollie Street, BB Bus, the path connection to McCarthy, and then Vilas Road path connection to Bakken Park. So I'll open it up to this group on if that's the formal recommendation or if there's projects that still should be peeled back.
I guess a question about North Lawn Pond. We're really talking about doing a study, and maybe the study won't say, no, North
Maybe a
Lawn
different-
is like the second or third on the list. You should do this and this, which may be significantly less or maybe significantly more. But, you know, that's, I guess that I would say is we need to do the study first, is what we should have our eye on, and then it'll determine what that next thing will be in order to continue to improve our compliance, and obviously with crazy weather, also to make sure that people, as much as we can, keep them out of the water.
I would agree that I would feel, especially when we're not quite sure what year that could potentially be, and again, what the net cost would be. I think it would be appropriate to not move forward with it, to the
Well,
recommendation, yeah.
Yeah, the stormwater plan for sure,
Yeah.
that we need to do next, or whenever it's planned for,
Yep.
next year, as soon as possible. And then that will create what we need to do next and dictate kind of from this body as well as village board and others, what really is the appropriate step.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because it was, what area are we going to make the most impact and actually meet the requirements? So,
Yeah.
yeah, that makes sense.
And either way, they're gonna move forward with the grant requests, right?
Yep,
Yeah.
so the village board did a formal resolution. I think if it was a resolution to commit that we would continue to look at that.
That's right.
Any other questions? We'll just call it the Cameron.
Just
I'll
a,
make-
oh,
Call
sorry,
it
Go
the-
ahead, Sarah.
I'll extend the meeting just a bit with one more comment. Just looking at the historical 5 years on the tax sheet that Cameron handed out, going back probably 5 beyond that, at least the board for the past decade has been pretty consistent on, there may be some peaks and valleys, but generally speaking, a general goal, I think, has been to stay pretty close to $100 on kind of a tax impact for the average home per year. And looking at the bare bones, including the possible revaluation at the top of Cameron's sheet, and seeing that possibly come down almost to half, is a good indicator that, you know, that's the benefit of the growth that we're having and the success with our TIF districts and filling up the Commerce Park and having that close and adding in all the other new construction in the village. So it's just helpful to point that out, because I think, you know, sometimes year to year, residents might not see the benefit of, hey, we're growing, but, you know, why aren't taxes coming down, or why isn't there some relief? And some of that is due to the issues with levy limits and the fact that we don't get a one-for-one chance to increase our levy with the growth. It's a reduced factor. But even with that, you know, we're able to, you know, maintain these services, grow them strategically, and at least in this plan, show more modest than we've historically seen from a tax impact perspective.
And again, when we were presenting the police station initially, our target was, let's get a $300 impact on the police station. Now, this $300 a year increase as our kind of all-in max bucket. So now when we talk about other factors, debt coming off, the MSB, and kind of the when you mesh them together, this obviously paints a much prettier picture and a much more, I think, digestible on, the growth has really allowed us to kind of maintain, a steady rate. That's not going to cause, it's an investment in the community. But this is what we feel is a good sustainable option. And I decided that this is going to be called the budget reviews version. Capital.
Well, I'll make the motion that we approve the budget reviews or financial plan that includes all of what Cameron read off a few minutes ago, minus the North Lawn Pond. Did I get that right?
Yep. Is there a second?
Second.
We have a motion and second then. Any other discussion? Having heard none, all those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Anybody abstain? Motion carries. All right. Now that you've talked about a lot of finance, anybody want to go for item number 6?
Motion to adjourn.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Motion second then, non-debatable. All those in favor?
Aye.
We are adjourned. Everybody have a good rest of your week.